All right, we are going to move on here and get Nathalie started in just a moment. Nathalie Laidler Kylander, she is a professor in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. She has a vast background in marketing and branding, and in particular for nonprofits in themselves. She's taught in management, she's taught in leadership, decision making, as well as strategic management for nonprofits. So she has quite the vast background here for the kind of information that is helpful for you as you're thinking about branding your cause or your nonprofit. So hopefully Nathalie will get on. Nathalie, are you there?
I hope so. Yes. Can you hear me?
Great, I can hear you. Thank you so much for being with us today. Let me
My
move
pleasure.
forward. Move forward here to your slide. So if you wouldn't mind just starting and give us a little bit of background of who you are and how you got interested in what you're doing. I know that you're doing a lot of different things, but we'd like to hear how you got passionate about what you're doing now.
Sure. So, let's see. I think I've been working and researching nonprofit brands for just over a decade now. And the way I got involved is that I have worked for nonprofits before business school. And I was having lunch with my marketing professor, and he was looking at a survey done by Edelman PR that looks at the most trusted brands in the world, and this is about 12 years ago or so now. And what we saw was that a lot of those most trusted brands were nonprofit brands, and it was really interesting because although there's been a lot of work and research done about for-profit brands, there hasn't been anything, or hadn't at that time been much done or much work done on nonprofit brands. And so we started writing case studies that we use here at the business school as teaching tools. But we were really trying to explore the role of brand for nonprofit organizations. And then I continued that research, doing a PhD looking at the drivers of brand equity for nonprofit organizations and how that differed from for-profit organizations. And so that was sort of the part, a large part of my research for a while, to understand how nonprofit brands were being built and managed in a way that was different from for-profit brands. And then most recently, a friend and colleague of mine, Julia Shepard Stenzel, and I published a book called The Brand Idea. That's IDEA, Managing Nonprofit Brands with Integrity, Democracy, and Affinity. And it's really a new model to manage nonprofit brands, because we really felt that nonprofit brands have to be managed differently. They play a different role for nonprofit organizations than they do for profit organizations. And so there was really a need for a new framework and a new management model for nonprofit brands. And that research, or that book, was based on extensive research that we did out of the Hauser Center here at the Harvard Kennedy School, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And we interviewed about 100 people, and really the model, the brand idea framework, is the result of a lot of people sharing their current brand management expertise.
Wonderful. It sounds like you have a lot of great data to pull from and a lot of good research. That's wonderful. Um, so talk a little bit about, nonprofit branding, and I like what you said about how some of the strongest brands with the most loyalty are nonprofit brands. What do you think it is about nonprofit branding that is different than corporations, and why it's building some of that trust?
So, I mean, I think that organizations in the nonprofit sector are fundamentally different than those in the for-profit sector, and I've worked in both sectors. And one of the reasons is that there are just that many more stakeholders in the nonprofit world, and therefore that many more brand audiences. So it's not just about donors as brand audiences, but it's also potential partners, it's also volunteers, it's definitely the beneficiaries that you serve, and interestingly enough, it's also internal stakeholders, employees in particular, that are really big major brand audiences. So that's one of the major differences from a for-profit organization, which tends to be much more focused, as Josh was saying, on the consumer. So the role of the brand in the nonprofit sector and a nonprofit organization is a lot more complex, because it has to deal with a larger number and a broader array of brand audiences.
Yes, absolutely. So if a nonprofit was to sit down and start some of that branding process that Josh was talking about, how would you recommend for them to think about these different audiences and think about how to brand to each unique segment?
So, I mean, the first point I think to mention is that brand is actually composed of two elements. There's the brand identity, which is really the sort of internal perception of the brand that's linked very much to positioning, which is what Josh was talking about, and differentiation. But it's really about your internal perception, and we like to talk about identity as who you are, what you do, and why it's important. It isn't just who you are, right? But it's very much what you do and why that's important, and that's really anchored in the mission. So the brand identity, which is anchored in the vision, the mission and the values of the organization, is kind of the internal conception of the brand. There's also an external part of the brand, which is the brand image. And the brand image is really that set of beliefs and emotions that are held in the minds of your external audiences, be they donors or beneficiaries or partners. And it's really the external perception of the brand. And so making sure that there is alignment between the identity, the internal perception of the brand, and the external perception, which is really captured in the image, is really a big part of brand management in the nonprofit space. But this is also true to a certain extent in the for-profit space. But because of the complexity of audiences, it makes it a little bit more complicated to manage. I would say, though, that you really do have to try and have a single brand across audiences, right? And so this alignment between identity and image is really important, particularly since in a lot of nonprofit organizations, the donors or the people who are funding the organization aren't necessarily the people who are using the organization's services and products. And so there may be a disconnect. There's not this direct feedback loop that you have in the for-profit sector. And that's why the role of trust is so important. And one of the main jobs of the brand is to create that trust with external stakeholders. And part of the way you achieve that trust is making sure that your brand identity, who you are, what you do, and what you say you do, is actually truly reflective of what you're actually doing.
For sure. I know that a lot of our clients have this question when they're thinking about branding is who should they focus on when they're thinking about their branding and messaging? Maybe there's like some sort of hierarchy in terms of audience, because I think it's easy for nonprofits to want to focus on their donors because that's where they're getting their funding. What advice would you say when you're kind of creating that hierarchy of audiences?
So I think this is sort of fundamental. If you flip forward a slide or so, there's a graph that we have called the paradigm shift. And yeah, you just had it up, actually. Yep, perfect. And so in the paradigm shift, and this is sort of what we're seeing in the nonprofit space right now, the old model really looks at brand as a logo or a fundraising tool or PR tool that's all about communications. And a lot of that old paradigm really comes directly from the for-profit sector, where the job of the brand was to create a competitive advantage, right, in terms of positioning, and that you're really trying to project a particular image onto donors in particular, and that brand lives within communications and marketing. That's sort of where it is. And very often in this old paradigm, what's happening is that the brand is an afterthought, right? The brand is something you do in a way that's disconnected from the mission of the organization just to raise funds. And when we encounter skepticism in the nonprofit sector, it's really because of this old paradigm where brand is all about trying to raise money or create a particular image, and it's somehow disconnected from the organization's mission. And we encountered a number of organizations that are really shifting in their perspective of brand and their understanding of the brand as much more of a strategic asset that's focused on implementing the mission and mission impact. And so that really fundamentally shifts how you think about brand and the role of brand in the organization, so that it's really much less about donors and much more about understanding the spectrum of both internal and external stakeholders, and engaging those, similar to what Josh was talking about, engaging those different stakeholders both in the articulation and the communication of brand. And that's sort of fundamental to our democracy piece of our framework, is really trying to engage all kinds of stakeholders in both defining and then communicating that brand, so that you're creating a broader set of brand ambassadors. And when you think about brand as really the articulation of the mission and all about implementing the mission and trying to achieve social change, that gives you a very different approach and view to brand management.
Yes, absolutely. I like what you said about building brand ambassadors. Is that something that you would start internally with your employees, or how would you go about doing that?
So I think, when you, going back to something that Josh had mentioned in terms of social media, I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that with the growth of social media, it's really impossible to control your brand anymore, right? It's not necessarily desirable, but it's also practically impossible. And so you have to kind of flip it on its head and say, well, what do I do then to actually release my brand so that a lot of people can be talking about my brand in a way that's authentic to them and also consistent with the brand identity. And so I think brand ambassadors, and thinking about arming brand ambassadors with a set of tools and engaging them in the process of branding will help you achieve that. And there are a number of examples in the book of organizations that have done that very effectively, right? Engaged both internal stakeholders in a discussion and dialogue of the brand, but also external stakeholders, and allowed them to participate in building the brand, either by uploading their own personal stories or by sharing their experiences, so that the brand becomes less about the organization and more about both the beneficiaries and all kinds of brand ambassadors.
Great. And as we're thinking about nonprofit branding, what advantages do you think nonprofits have over corporations when they're thinking about their brand?
So, I mean, I think the first one is sort of emotional connection, right? I mean, I think people work for nonprofit organizations because they believe in the mission. Donors donate because they believe the organization is addressing a particular need that is of high emotional importance to the donors. And then fundamentally, we're changing lives, right? We're really having an impact on beneficiaries in many cases, where we're really changing and impacting people's lives on a very individual and really relevant basis. So I think we have a great advantage in the emotional connection that we can create with our brands.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you one of the same questions that I was talking with Josh is, what is one of the biggest mistakes that you see across causes or nonprofits with regards to branding?
So I think if going back to the paradigm shift, I think there's there are a lot of organizations that basically are in this old paradigm and really thinking about brand as a logo, a color palette, a message, and focusing a lot of their brand efforts on just the donors. And I think it's a huge missed opportunity. I think donors are part of the audiences, but essentially they won't get a feeling of true authenticity until that brand is anchored in the mission and the values of the organization. And they're just one of the stakeholders that the brand has to address. So I think the biggest error is for nonprofits not to understand the sort of broader role that the brand can play in implementing mission for a nonprofit organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really good advice.
And just to kind of add to that, you know, a lot of smaller organizations will say, oh, we don't have the money or the expertise to do brand and brand management. And I think we really believe that it's less about money, because we don't think it's about communication entirely. And it's really much more about having a mindset. And I would echo what Josh said about engaging stakeholders and asking different stakeholders what they believe and what they feel and how they understand both the positioning of the organization and how that's reflected in the brand.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, and I think that's something nonprofits can definitely get behind. How would you recommend to kind of start that process? Is it something where you ask those questions through social media, or you just start word of mouth? How would you go through that?
I think you could do both of those, but I think, you know, in your sort of daily operations and the daily job that you have, you can take a moment to ask whoever you're interacting with, what do you think of our organization? What do we do well? What are our key strengths? So that you're really trying to get back to that notion of differentiation and understanding who the organization is, what they do, and why it's important. And so just in your daily interaction with different stakeholders, you could sort of build that into part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely start doing focus groups or holding meetings internally so that kind of dialogue is occurring within the organization as well. One of the things that we found is that nonprofit brands, strong nonprofit brands, can create a sense of organizational cohesion. So the process of engaging people in talking about the brand and articulating the brand really helps internal stakeholders really gain a sense of clarity about the organization and a sense of really belonging and understanding and kind of a cohesion. It's like the glue that holds an organization. That's particularly true for organizations that are dispersed geographically, or also that have different activity areas associated within one organization. So having a real sense of how the brand pulls everybody together internally is one of those key roles that a brand plays in a nonprofit organization, which isn't necessarily a role that it might play in a for-profit company, for example.
Sure, yes. So let's say hypothetically a nonprofit starts to go through that process and does focus groups of research and is getting some of this information back. What happens when they start to get or hear things that they don't really like, or that's not really what they wanted to hear about their organization? What would you recommend that they do at that time?
So are you talking about sort of the internal feedback that they're getting, or more external stakeholders?
I would say either one. I mean, if there's just a misperception of the brand and who they are and what they do, how would you handle that?
Great. So, I mean, I think a lot of rebranding processes start exactly at that point, right, where the brand image is misaligned with the brand identity. And it's not uncommon, actually, for organizations that have been around for 40, 50 years for there to be a lag between brand identity and brand image. You know, as the context changes, as an organization grows and develops expertise, what an organization actually does can evolve with time, and so does the mission. The mission can evolve also to remain current over time. And so what happens is that people external to the organization may hold on to an image that might lag the organization's current set of activities and identity. So this disconnect between image and identity is often at the heart of a rebranding process. You know, people don't understand what we do as clearly, or there is a misperception about what we do, and so that will trigger a rebranding process. And I'd say, you know, rebranding or really thinking about brand has to be done within more of a broader strategic planning framework, and also a real understanding or reevaluation potentially of the mission. So, you know, we've talked about brand identity as being anchored in the mission. Sometimes missions become slightly outdated, and so that disconnect between identity and image may also be because the mission itself needs to be looked at more clearly. And you know, in the nonprofit sector that lacks that metric of performance, which is the bottom line, the mission is incredibly important. And so actually gaining really good clarity on the mission, and really making sure that the mission is current and clearly articulated, and really serving the purposes of what a mission should be for an organization is kind of the starting point to brand identity. And then you're really trying to make sure that brand identity and brand image are aligned. And we believe that the way you achieve that alignment, or what we call brand integrity, you can do through this participation of stakeholders, which we talk about as brand democracy.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think one challenge that we've seen essentially with our clients is, let's say you realize that your mission is outdated, or you realize there's this disconnect between image and identity. Sometimes there's a lot of bureaucracy, or you might have a lot of, you know, board input and all these other people who are kind of controlling that. How do you start to get some of that buy-in for the rebrand, or buy-in to help align those things?
Great. So I think the first step is really trying to make sure that everybody in the organization is on board with what a brand is and why it's important to the organization, because there's still a lot of skepticism in our sector about brand, about marketing in general, but about brand in particular. And that skepticism is really anchored in the old paradigm. So the first thing to do is to really try to get everybody in the organization to shift to this new paradigm, and understanding brand as really the embodiment of the mission, and the job of the brand as mission implementation as opposed to fundraising, right? That's really the key first step. And so that will involve so internal dialogues, discussion, and sort of getting both board members, the executive team, and also employees to kind of go through that shift. And what can help in that shift is actually asking external stakeholders to reflect on what they believe are the organization's strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, the Girl Scouts USA did a rebranding a couple of years ago, and they used that external data, external stakeholder analysis and data, which is what Josh mentioned in terms of a brand audit, to help drive the understanding and the recognized need for work on the brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. That's really helpful. So I know that you said that brand is really more about mindset and not so much communication, but do you have any, you know, tools or technologies or things that you've seen work really well for nonprofits in terms of building their brand?
So I think, you know, the focus on brand ambassadors is really helpful. And so what you really want to try and create are some tools and some assets that can provide guidelines. So we sort of mentioned that you want to perhaps sort of reduce the control and sort of flip that on its head, and try to provide all kinds of tools and resources for a variety of stakeholders and brand ambassadors to be able to use to promote the brand. I do believe that, you know, you do want to get some consistency, but I don't think that consistency has to be as draconian as you know, sort of past brand management models or for-profit brand management models dictate. So I think it's better to have a degree of flexibility and provide stories, photos, templates, all kinds of tools that people can pull from internally and externally, but basically brand ambassadors can use to communicate about the organization and talk about the organization, so that instead of sort of controlling what people are saying and doing, you're curating it, right? And so you're providing all kinds of tools that people can download or upload. Lincoln Center does a really good job letting people participate in uploading their stories, and also sort of pushing out short videos or photographs of a particular performance and asking patrons to email those on, so that you're really creating opportunities for people who are invested in the organization to participate in communicating their authentic connection to the brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can definitely see how that will help build some of that emotional appeal and emotional buy-in to pull on getting your constituents engaged and getting them conversing and talking about what you're doing as an organization.
It's really interesting, actually. Just I have another thought to add to this particular issue. So Josh mentioned Susan G. Komen a lot, and I don't know if you or your listeners remember the controversy a couple of years ago between Planned Parenthood and Susan G. Komen, and they had a very different approach to controlling the brand. During that controversy, Susan G. Komen really tried to control the message and to sort of channel a one-way communication about what was going on, whereas Planned Parenthood really released and gave ownership of the issue to its brand ambassadors. And so people were uploading their stories, people were engaging in the discussion in a way that was very authentic and genuine and incredibly more powerful, and really relying on brand ambassadors to speak for the organization and for the brand. And so that's a really interesting, I think, case study to look at in terms of the different approaches to particularly kind of when you've got a sort of an emergency or a controversy that exists, how you approach the communication around a particular issue that rises like that.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting story, and I think that could be a struggle for a lot of these nonprofits, is giving up some of that control and being worried about maybe some of the bad press or some of the negative comments. How would you recommend an organization goes about dealing with some of that negative connotation that comes with some of these situations?
So I think there are two parts to that, right? I mean, I think there's always a little bit of a risk in terms of giving up complete control, so that people might misuse the brand or say something about the brand that is not in line with the identity. But interestingly, the more you release and push down to brand ambassadors, more those brand ambassadors take on the role of correcting the misperceptions or the things that people are saying that are not necessarily positive. So let me give you another example. This is from China, an organization called Free Lunch for Children. And the reason why that's an interesting example is that they were very open and very transparent in everything that they did. And so everything was up on their website, and people could place comments and suggestions. People could provide recommendations. And so they were they really engaged participation. And they had one or two people that were making allegations about misuse of funds or misappropriation of funding. And the organization basically did nothing. It let its brand ambassadors kind of point out the errors of what was being miscommunicated. And so that the actual more freedom that you give, the more likely you'll have people correct misperceptions or come to the organization's defense.
Wow, that's a very powerful story. I think that's really encouraging. Can you talk a little bit more about being transparent and honest as an organization? What specific things can a nonprofit do to help build some of that honesty and transparency among their constituents?
So I think the first thing is to really make sure everybody, really knows and understands the mission, because that's sort of the starting point. And everybody can then make decisions and take action in alignment with that mission. The second point, I think, in terms of transparency, and this is another thing that really differs, that is a point of big differentiation between the for-profit and non-profit sectors. In our sector, nonprofits cannot achieve their objectives alone. We really can only create social change and promote impact if we partner with others. And so the end goal, or the goal of the organization, is not, or the goal of the brand really is not competitive positioning. It's really about gaining clarity in terms of who you are, what you do, why it's important, but then using that clarity and positioning, clarity and brand, to promote partnerships, to understand which partners to work with, but also to support those partners with this shared external goal, right? With this sort of a broader shared social impact goal.
Absolutely. Are you also seeing anything with regards to our constituents wanting to see financials? Are they wanting to be more involved in the organization on the back end or on the business side? Do you see any of that as trends in building some of that trust as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. There is a movement to increase transparency and increased accountability as well, right? And so those are kind of par for the course. And I think the sort of the movement towards this sort of new paradigm is in line with that as well. The more transparent you are about the mission and implementing the mission and being the driving force behind the organization, the easier it is actually to be transparent. And to drive accountability to all stakeholders. So there's a couple of interesting things that are occurring. Increasingly, for example, on boards, we're seeing the participation of beneficiaries, which seems kind of obvious until you look around in our sector and notice that most boards do not contain beneficiaries on their boards, which is kind of always intriguing. But increasingly, for example, organizations that are trying to provide services to homeless people will have homeless people on their boards, which makes a lot of sense, I think, in terms of accountability. So that transparency and accountability, those are shifts that are occurring that are really in line with more of a kind of democratic approach to managing your brand as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that's really good advice about the boards. Having people who are beneficiaries on that definitely makes sense.
Right, and it's all about making sure that it's not just about the donors. It's sort of in line with the paradigm shift, right? Because if you really think that your customer is the donor, and that's who you're putting on your board, you're missing the point, I think, which is implementation of the mission and serving a group of beneficiaries or a constituency, and that the role of the brand is really to make sure that you're implementing and reaching the needs of those beneficiaries. And so having those beneficiaries on the board is really in line with that paradigm shift.
Absolutely. I know you've talked a lot about, really cost-effective ways to promote brand, and I think giving up some of that control and letting your brand ambassadors take that and run with it is really important. Do you have any other tips for nonprofits, especially when it comes to being budget conscious, that are helpful when building your brand?
Right. So, I mean, the brand is not really necessarily a logo, right? I mean, I think that's sort of people tend to get anxious about the logo and the tagline and sort of the visual elements of the brand. And I would say, I would suggest that should not really be the focus. That in fact, it's not really so much about creating a beautiful beautiful visual, and it's much more about being authentically connected to the mission. And so it's about dialogue and engaging all kinds of stakeholders in a dialogue around who we are, what we do, why it's important, and then letting a variety of stakeholders participate so that beneficiaries are really talking about their own stories and uploading those stories, and so that becomes part of the brand, and that partners are communicating why they work with a particular organization and what the partnership is doing in terms of creating social change. So that I think the types of message and media and opportunities for communication are so much broader than just creating a really nice glossy brochure for donors, right? So I think there are opportunities to build your brand and manage your brand as part of your daily operations of going about creating social change and implementing your mission.
Yes, definitely agree. I'd like to ask you the same thing I asked Josh earlier. What cause or nonprofit do you see out there that really stands out and is a really good example that some of our listeners here could use to inspire some of the things that they might do with their brand?
So in terms of what we've been talking a lot about in terms of freeing up your brand assets and sharing those with partners and focusing on a kind of a shared goal, I would suggest that the Girl Effect is a really interesting example. So the Girl Effect is basically a website, but it's more of a movement. And what they've tried to do, their objective was really to raise awareness and gain support for programs that look and address the needs of teenage girls in developing countries. And so their theory of change, if you will, is that if you take a 12-year-old girl and keep her in school and delay pregnancy and onset of early marriage, that you really can have a dramatic effect on intergenerational poverty. And so rather than trying to just raise funds for their own programs, what they did is created a platform where they tried to create what they call Girl Effect champions. And those Girl Effect champions essentially could be organizations or individuals or anybody who really bought into that theory of change and that really believed that this was an important cause to address. And so they've done a lot of what we talked about in terms of making their brand assets available to anybody. So you can download their logo for anything you need to in order to kind of promote the cause. There are posters, there are stories, there's a bunch of data and facts and figures that you can use. And so it's really exciting because what has evolved is basically a sort of a movement with hundreds of partners, including high school teenage girls in all across the U.S. sort of doing bake sales and downloading the brand tools and being Girl Effect champions. And so it's a very, I think, an interesting example of a lot of what we talk about in terms of both brand democracy, but also essentially brand affinity.
Yeah, that's a really great example. I think that goes back to Josh's point on how taking one thing or one statistic or just a few simple things that you can do to create really big change is very effective in branding. Do you have any advice for small nonprofits on how they might go about figuring that out and what their big change might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that a smaller nonprofit can do is to try to identify partners that will help them implement their mission more effectively. And so I don't mean just fundraising partners. I really mean partners in their ecosystem, but also maybe across sectors as well. So if you can gain real clarity as a small nonprofit in terms of what you do that's different from other organizations and where your sort of strengths are, it helps you to identify the partners that you need to work with in order to be able to achieve your mission, or make strides towards implementing your mission.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that that is an important process to go through, and to recognize that brand is very much part of that process of identifying and driving those partnerships.
Yes, absolutely. I want to pause here for just a minute and say that you're welcome to type in your questions here into the box on GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar, and I would be happy to pass those along. So if you have any questions, we've had just a few minutes left, but feel free to type those in and we can get those answered here in the next few minutes. Why don't you take a moment here, Nathalie, to tell the rest of our listeners how they can get involved or how they could follow you, what kind of things you might be doing in the future that they can participate in.
Oh, sure. So I just wanted to say, sort of our mission in writing this book was really to provide a framework and a set of tools and ideas for how nonprofit organizations can use brand to further their mission. So that was really, we felt like there was a lack of a really good brand management model, and that's sort of the rationale why we wrote the book. So the book is called The Brand Idea, and it's managing nonprofit brands with integrity, democracy, and affinity. And it has hundreds of examples of organizations. And so it's really the words and work of a variety of different organizations, large, small, across different sectors, not just here in the U.S., but also internationally. And so in the book, we hope others will find inspiration and ideas for managing their brand, and it's really a tribute, I think, to what a tremendous work a lot of us are doing in the nonprofit sector. So it's very inspirational to read and to hear about what other organizations, large and small, new and old, are currently doing to manage their brands to really achieve mission impact. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And then we also have a website that's the nonprofit, or I guess it's just nonprofitbrandidea.com. And there we have a number of resources, articles, web posts, podcasts. And so you're definitely free to go in there and take a look at those resources and use those. The framework is based on an article that was published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review back in 2012, and that article is available online for free as well. So there's a lot of resources that you can use.
Great, that's really helpful. And is there any research out there that nonprofits might be able to look at, or things that you're involved with on your university side that might be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of more academic articles that look at the drivers of brand equity, and so all of those, I think, are listed on our website. The Hauser Center or the Hauser Institute at the John F. Kennedy School, or the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard, is also a good resource for people looking to manage their nonprofit organizations. And I would say, brand is much more than communication. Really, brand is is really about the strategy and the ability for an organization to effectively implement their mission. And so that's how we perceive of it, really much more of a strategic asset and not just a communication tool.
Great. Well, I haven't seen any questions come in, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up now. But this has been very informative, Nathalie. We thank you so much for taking time to be with us. I know that this is a lot of good information. It might be a little overwhelming for these small nonprofits, but definitely a lot to think about and some really good ideas. So thank you for participating today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been my great pleasure. I hope it has been helpful.
Thank you. So for the rest of you here listening, again, this is being recorded, and so it will be available for you after the webinar, and it'll be available through a follow-up email as well as through Vimeo Pro and Achieve Access if you are a member of that. So thank you so much for joining us today, and We have our next webinar coming up on June 24th on building relationships that last. So be sure to check that out and get registered for that now. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.